Hi there. Tonight we're discussing macro photography, or as Nikon calls it, micro photography. That's due to their heritage of production of microscopes and stuff like that. Anyway, either way, it doesn't matter. It means the same thing as far as the photographer's concerned. It only differs with the manufacturer. Usually it's for photographing very small subjects, living organisms like insects, where the size of the subject in the photograph is greater than life size. Microphotography also refers to the art of making very large photographs. By the original definition, a microphotograph is one in which the size of the subject on the image sensor is life size or greater. In some cases, however, it refers to a finished photograph of a subject that is greater than life size. The ratio of the subject size on the film plane or the sensor plane to the actual object size is known as the reproduction ratio. Likewise, a macro lens is classically a lens capable of a reproduction ratio of 1:1, although it often refers to any lens with a large reproduction ratio, despite rarely exceeding 1:1. Apart from technical photography and film-based processes where the size of the image on the image sensor is the subject of discussion, the finished print or on-screen image more commonly lends a photograph its micro status. For example, when producing a 6x4" print using a 36x24 sensor, a life-size result is possible with a lens having only a 1:4 reproduction ratio. Reproduction ratios much greater than 10:1 are considered to be photomicrography, often achieved with digital microscopes. Photomicrography should not be confused with microphotography, the art of making very small photographs such as microforms. Due to the advances in sensor technology, today's small sensor digital cameras can rival the macro capabilities of a DSLR with a true macro lens. Despite having a lower reproduction ratio, making microphotography more widely accessible at lower cost in the digital age, a true macro photograph can be more practically defined as a photograph with a vertical subject height of 24mm or less. So I now want to go on to demonstrate various methods of achieving a macro photograph or a macro lenses in various forms. A couple of the lenses are actually quite old. They come from the late 70s and can be used with extension tubes. They can be used in terms of reversing the lens. Predominantly this is because they are completely manual lenses. There is no autofocus, there's no auto exposure. You have to set these things manually. The biggest problem is getting the damn things in focus, because lens to subject distance is critical. You have a very small range, and we'll go ahead and illustrate some of the problems and the equipment necessary to actually carry this out. Okay, what we have here, obviously a tripod. We've got the camera mount, and this is adjustable for both height, and it will allow us to pan across the subject as well. I've also put on a counterweight which helps stabilise the tripod, because the camera is going to be cantilevered off the tripod further, and it helps to counterbalance the weight and stops the darn thing tipping over. I've got a plinth here which is adjustable in height on a second tripod, and that's where our subject will be put on. These here are extra lighting, just to try, it's not so much to light the subject up, but it's more to stabilise the light and give us a fairly stable effect. As we all know in photography, lighting is critical, because after all said and done, that's what we're capturing. So here goes. Right, the setup once the camera's on, I've got a 55mm lens, which is from about 1976. It's a macro lens. It's attached to a modern camera, and it can be used. Okay. The one benefit I've got to say of, shall we say, the Nikons is that all the lenses pretty much from the 1950s will actually fit the current cameras. They're obviously all manual. Now to do this, I've got the lighting set up. It's about as good as focus as I can actually get with this particular lens, and that's not a fault, I don't think, of the lens or even the camera. I've got a remote release, and I've set this up so that I've got half a second between pressing the button to expose and to taking the photograph. That way it allows the camera to steady down after the shutter has released and potentially induced a degree of vibration. So I'll take the shot. And that's it. I'm going to try improving in the focus now. Whether it'll work or not is difficult to say. Just tease it a little bit. Yeah, it's not as bad. I think it's about as good as we're going to get. So we'll take another shot. Here we go. And that's the camera taking the shot. So, one of the problems we have is that if we're shooting anything, I suppose, insect or otherwise, and it's at an angle. Now, because the macro lens has a very shallow depth of field, in order to get the full length, and what we have here is a bolt which is 36 millimeters long, and what I'm attempting to do is to get the whole thing in focus. In the early part of it, I focus on the nearest part, and then I set the camera into action, and that is simply done by touching the touchscreen. And now it's setting up to take the pictures, and it's opened its thing, and if you look carefully you may be able to see the focus ring actually changing throughout the picture being taken. At the end of this you'll hear the click from the shutter, which lets me know that it's taken all the shots. In this case 35 of them. What I'm trying to do is to achieve the whole bolt in focus by focus stacking. It should be finished any moment. That's it, it's taken the shots. So we can check this by just simply going to the view. You can see the head of the bolt is in focus, and I started off at the very end of the bolt, the nearest part. So what we need to do with this one, this will need to go into Lightroom and then be exported to Photoshop where the focus stacking can take place, and I'll show that on the screen shortly. So for the final illustration, basically what I'm doing is copying a slide. Now you can see that where the camera is mounted, it's on a rack where the lens is on a set of bellows and the slide is at the very end. As a light source I've got an LED panel, and you can see pretty much how things are. We can vary the focus by moving the camera, which is independent of the lens, and indeed focusing the lens separately. We can also vary the distance of the lens from the slide. So there's three elements of adjustment that we have here. Now if we switch the camera on, you can see, if we go into live view, this is the slide. Okay, so we take the shot, it's in focus, and that's it, the shot's taken. I've got the camera on quiet mode. That means that the mechanical shutter is not releasing, it's done by a rear curtain. There we go, there's the picture. So there we have it. There's not much more to say than that. Normally I would use daylight, but in the situation where we have a rather grey day, as you can see outside, I've used the light source as the LED panel, and that seems to work very well. Okay. Now all we need to do now is download all these pictures, stick them on the computer, and we can see the results, which I'll share with you. Here we have a £1 coin measuring just a fraction over 23 millimeters in diameter. Should have gone in a bit closer on this one, but anyway, it shows the whole coin, not quite fitting to the 24mm, but that's my fault. It's shot using a 55mm lens, which dates back to the mid-70s. Still works very well, completely manual lens, focus and f-stop. Fits the modern camera, and you can still take meter readings through the camera. We then move on to same coin, this time shot with a 24mm lens that has a 14mm extension tube applied to it. The lens of the same era as the 55 back in the 70s. A useful lens, it's quite a nice wide angle lens, but again completely manual, and I just shot this wide open at 2.8. Then we come on to the surprise of them all. This is using the same 24mm lens reversed, using an adapter ring which screws onto the front end of the lens, which has on the other side of the adapter a bayonet connection known as an F adapter. This has given us probably around about 3:1 in terms of magnification, and it's really quite impressive. It's a very, very good lens, good wide angle lens actually, and but yes, with the extension tube, it makes quite a difference. So, it's worth mentioning that the kit that I've used in doing all of this, and it's just here. Here we have the 24mm lens, the 55, both circa 1970s, a modern 105mm lens, macro that is, as is the 55. Here we have the extension tubes, 8mm, 14 and 27.5. Over here we have an adapter ring which fits on the, I'll call it the exposed ends of the lens when it's reversed, because there's no means of the camera connecting with the trigger that actually operates the aperture on the camera, on the lens. We've got a cable release that goes into this side here, which splits into two. The other side goes as an electrical release, which sends a signal to the camera to take the shot. First thing that happens is this closes down the lens to whatever f-stop you've selected, and the second thing is you continue pressing, it triggers the camera to release the shot. Over here we have the reversal ring. The reversal ring is threaded on one side, in this case 52mm, which matches both of these lenses, and on the other side is what's called the F-mount, which is the bayonet connection between normally between the lens and the camera. You need to be careful with these because modern cameras have lots of electrical contacts just inside the, what would you call it, the lens aperture on the face of the camera. The earlier versions would have interfered with the electrical contacts, whereas this one here is a more modern version which copes with the modern camera and its electrical contacts, and what they've done is they've adjusted the, I suppose, the depth and the diameter of the F-mount, which makes sure that it clears it. So with that said, be careful. But these things are available. The likes of these lenses, the 55, the 24, the extension rings, and all the other stuff. This is all relatively cheap and can be purchased on eBay. All you've got to do is search for it. Even the 105mm lens I bought on eBay. It's my preferred shop. It's much cheaper than the normal shops. So there we go. Here we go. We've downloaded all the layers now.
It was all very primitive. But in the late 60s, a gadget came along that I think was the best of the lot.
My favourite game show, the one I really remember, which was The Golden Shot.
Live from Birmingham, it's The Golden Shot.
It was massive.
First broadcast in 1967,
Be very careful with this.
The Golden Shot was the first truly interactive game show we'd ever seen. To win prizes, members of the audience would fire an actual crossbow across the studio. And in a revolutionary move, Viewers could also phone in from home to play along too.
Hello, who's calling the Golden Shot?
Assisting host Bob Monkhouse with the show's famous gadget was prop man Bernie the Bolt.
And go ahead and put the bolt in, Bern.
Well, Bernie the Bolt was the person who put the bolts into the crossbow to fire,
All ready, are we, Bernie? Bung the bolt in.
and then they had to shoot the target.
Right, stop, left, stop, down.
And then they'd say, stop, fire.
At the height of its popularity, 13 million viewers regularly tuned in to watch Bob and the gang. The series ran for 8 years, before the final golden shot was fired in 1975.
I think, yeah, so what we do next is we highlight them. And we go edit, and we come down. There's two items here. One is auto align layers. You would only do that if either the subject has moved slightly, or indeed the camera has moved, where you need alignment to take place within Photoshop. But because we're quite solidly mounted on a tripod, the subject hasn't moved, and so we can go straight to auto blend. Now you'll see here, this section is used for working out panoramas and stacking the images. So we go for stack the images, and it's okay for that. And very gradually you'll see the progress line, which is up here, and it will drift across the screen. We're now getting to the halfway mark. Still a bit of time to go. Let me just wait for it. There we go, the finished article. Completely in focus, end to end, that's what we wanted. Now, what we do here is we go File, and it sounds crazy, but we close the file. And when we hit the Save button, that will send it back to Lightroom. So let's go into Lightroom, see what we've got. Let's scroll up here. And there it is. Back into Lightroom, completely in focus, end to end. That's exactly what we're after. Well, this next part's called this circle of confusion. And believe you me, you might be confused afterwards, but we'll give it a best shot. To understand how the circle of confusion works, it's important to understand how camera lenses work and how they are able to focus light. In a convex lens, parallel rays... Whoa! I know a guy that could do this. A lot more simpler. Okay, yeah, well, that could work. We'll give it a try.
Many people feel the circle of confusion is aptly named because it's not always very well understood. But here's a simplified explanation. Take any point of light from in front of the lens. Light from that point passes through the lens and is bent to a matching point behind the lens. That point of convergence, where the beams come together and cross each other, is called the focal point. When the focal point falls exactly on the focal plane, which is the flat surface behind the lens where the camera's film or light sensor is located, that subject is in sharp focus. Light from different distances in front of the lens comes to convergence at different distances behind the lens. When you're adjusting focus, what you're actually doing is changing the point behind the lens where light from different distances comes to convergence. Looking at this a little bit more three-dimensionally, you can see these lines actually define the edges of a cone of light. When the point of that cone is on the surface of the focal plane, it makes a dot that's as small as it can be. But watch what happens as we rack through the focus. The point of convergence moves off the focal plane and we see a larger slice of the cone. The dot grows into a circle, very much like the street lights are doing behind me right now. When you rack back the other direction, you pass through the focal point, and now you're in the part of the cone where the light diverges. you get a circle again. And the whole thing looks on screen very much like what you're seeing happening behind me right now. The measurement of where a point of light grows to a circle you could actually see in the final image is called the circle of confusion. And it's actually measured in fractions of a millimeter on the surface of the target area. That number is what's used to calculate depth of field tables. Different media have different circles of confusion. And that's what defines what we call in or out of focus.
A bit like me, you're probably more confused by all of this, but there we go. Hiya. Malcolm suggested some time ago that I discuss hyperfocal distance. What is it? How does it affect what we do? Well, a hyperfocal distance is designed into the lens, or engineered into it, whichever way you please. And it varies according to the focal length of the lens and the f-stop, or your aperture. It's defined as, at its simplest, as the focus distance that gives you, your photographs, the greatest depth of field. For example, if you consider a landscape where you want everything, the foreground and the background, to appear sharp, if you focus on the foreground, the background will appear blurry in the image. And if you focus on the background, the foreground will appear blurry in the image as well. So how do you fix this? It's simple. You focus at a particular point between the foreground and the background, ensure that both are in focus, but don't change the focus point, and you take the picture. Now, the thing that you've got to remember is that there's an averaging situation here. You can get the foreground can be sharp, the background can be sharp, but I think the words we should really use are optically sharp, acceptably sharp. They won't necessarily be optical sharp. If you go pixel peeping, you'll see the difference. But if you're printing, you will see that there's an acceptability in the sharpness, and you will see both your foreground and the background into it. One interpretation of the hyperfocal distance varies with aperture. If you think about it like this, if your aperture is wide, such as f2, you will need to focus quite far away for the objects at infinity to appear in focus. However, at a smaller aperture of say f11 or f16, distant objects will continue to be sharp, even if your lens is focused more closely. So in this case, hyperfocal distance moves closer to your lens when you use a smaller aperture. By another interpretation though, hyperfocal distance does not vary with aperture. Why not? In this interpretation, hyperfocal distance is the focusing distance that provides equal sharpness between the foreground and the background. And that isn't something that changes as you alter your aperture, even as both the foreground and the background become more and more out of focus at wide apertures. The reason for these different interpretations is the key phrase, acceptably sharp. In the definition of hyperfocal distance, for some people, acceptably sharp is an exact value. Well, for other people, acceptably sharp means that the background is equal in sharpness to the foreground. Neither interpretation is wrong. And for the definition of hyperfocal distance allows us to use either. However, the second interpretation has the benefit of offering the sharpest overall photograph from front to back, since it doesn't prioritize the background sharpness over the foreground sharpness. Focal length also has a huge impact on hyperfocal distance. As you zoom in, your hyperfocal distance moves further and further away. For a 20mm lens, you may need to focus just a few feet from your lens. to get the horizon and distant background at infinity acceptably sharp. On the other hand, for a 200mm lens, your hyperfocal distance may be hundreds of feet away. It's important to note that if you focus at the hyperfocal distance, your photo will be sharp from half of that point to infinity. So if your hyperfocal distance for a given aperture and focal length is 10 feet, everything from 5 feet all the way until the horizon will appear sharp. And remember, it's the acceptability of sharpness. Hyperfocal distance won't come to the rescue if you have objects that are too close to your lens. For example, it's impossible for a distant object to be sharp at the same time as an object that is only a few inches away from your lens, unless you shoot with specialized equipment, such as a tilt and shift lens. Different types of lenses have obviously different, what would you call it, features in them. And the other way to do this, of course, is to use what we call focus stacking, which you've already seen when photographing the bolt. That's done at very close quarters, of course, but nonetheless it illustrates. You can use it on landscape work as well. There's a formula for this, obviously, and that is that the hyperfocal distance equals the focal length squared divided by the f-stop times an acceptable circle of confusion plus the focal length. You can use it, or you could download an app that will give you the actual the distances involved in this. And the thing to do really is to test this out to see how you get on. And that's about it. That's hyperfocal distance. Remember, it's all dependent on the focal length of the lens. The aperture you use will shift it, and for distant horizons or distant pictures, you'll find as I use it for photographs of landscapes that maybe 2 or 3 miles away, the hyperfocal distance is maybe only 2,000 feet, whereas the overall distance to a subject may be 2.5 miles. So that's the way I use it. Keep it at the back of your mind. It's not vitally important that you use it, but remember the phrase, acceptable focus. That's the key phrase. Okay.